and welcome to Finextra. I'm Emily Haller and I'm here with Simon Newstead of VocaLink. And we're at EBA Day 2016 in Milan. Thank you for joining me. What are the key practical challenges that need to be addressed to ensure that PSD2 is implemented successfully?
Well, if we look at the individual challenges first, so from an individual institution, the key challenges right now are standing up a compliance program and coming to the right decisions in terms of strategic opportunities. But what's more interesting perhaps is to look at some of the collaborative challenges. So there I'm thinking about things like needing to have a common understanding of the PSD2 text. I mean, it seems like a relatively straightforward request, but it's in everybody's interest to have a single understanding of what the text is saying. And then perhaps the bigger issue is the need to have a scenario that avoids fragmentation and avoids fragmentation risk. So if you look at what we've got in the PSD2 text, if you look what's likely to be coming from the EBA in the regulatory technical standards, they will define requirements, they won't define detailed technical solutions. So that leaves a gap, and the challenge for the market then, and it is a challenge to the market, is to say how are we going to fill those gaps and how are we going to define the right set of solutions and the right rules to mean that the PSD2 implementation is successful, meets its objectives and is harmonised.
So what needs to be done at an industry level to address these challenges? And are there any relevant learnings from the PSD1 implementation process?
Well, taking the second part of that question first, there are definitely relevant learnings from PSD1. So if I think back to PSD1, there was a considerable amount of collaborative industry activity required to have a harmonised implementation of PSD1. And for PSD1, there was no second level measures, there was no regulatory technical standards, and there was a single implementation date. So if there needed to be collaborative work for PSD1, by definition, there probably needs to be more for PSD2. Now, in terms of what's happening in the market currently, there is work going on, as there was for PSD1, following a very similar model, for industry to work together at European level and national level to come up with a common interpretation of the text. The piece that's different for PSD2 is the level of collaborative work that's going to be necessary to build on the work done in the PSD2 text, build on the RTS coming out of the EBA, and fill those gaps that I was talking about a bit earlier. So what are some of those gaps? So there's a need to define actual technical standards in a harmonised way. There's a need to have a common approach to a number of sort of operational processes, you could call them. So there are things like dispute management processes, things like fraud profiling services, even having a single registry or a number of registries for PIS and AIS providers that an ASPSP can call on in real time to make sure that a particular transaction has the appropriate authorization behind it. So there's some of the practical challenges that the industry now needs to rally round and figure out the answers to, come up with the right collaborative governance approach to solve these things, but also do it with some urgency. And I think that's probably the main lesson from PSD1, which is not to underestimate the level of and the intensity of collaborative activity that's going to be necessary to make PSD2 a success.
PSD2 and instant payments are two of the biggest trends at this year's EBA Day. How well do these two initiatives sit together?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. So to me, those two initiatives have dominated a lot of the sessions at EBA Day, and indeed a lot of the discussions around the event. And at first sight, I mean, they are different initiatives. PSD2 is a very specific regulatory initiative building on PSD1. The Instant Payments Initiative is again driven by a slightly different agenda, but drawing on certainly VocaLink's experiences in the UK with faster payment service, which we've had now since 2008. The number of use cases and the way that our faster payment service is now being used has just multiplied over the years since it was introduced. And if you start thinking about some of the use cases that are being talked about for PSD2 and the AIS and PIS services, things like personal financial management to pick one example, I think it's very clear that if you combine those services with an immediate or instant payments capability, you've got a much more powerful customer proposition. So I think they may have come from a different starting point, but those two initiatives are hugely complementary and are both building blocks to the next generation of payment propositions for the European ecosystem. So I think they work together really strongly, and we'll see that play out more and more over time.
Simon, thank you for speaking with me.
That's a pleasure, thank you.
And thank you for watching.